"Who exactly are you serving, Secretary Rubio?" Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asked, and she delivered the question as if the answer had already been decided before Marco Rubio ever opened his mouth, as if the hearing were not a place to test facts, but a stage on which she had already written the final line. The microphone was live, the cameras were rolling, and Ocasio-Cortez leaned into the moment with the polished confidence of someone who understood exactly how congressional footage travels once it leaves the room, clipped, captioned, pushed across cable news and social media before most people have even read the transcript. She pointed to the 90-day freeze on foreign aid and described children in sub-Saharan Africa going without food, clinics closing, mothers losing access to medicine, then turned the entire argument into one sharp accusation about power, priorities, and who Rubio believed government was supposed to serve. She spread her hands across the table and pushed the question again, not as a request for clarification, but as a charge, because the entire opening depended on keeping Rubio trapped inside the moral frame she had built for him. For several seconds, it looked exactly like the kind of confrontation Ocasio-Cortez knows how to manufacture. Emotional stakes first, a clean villain second, and a line ready to become a headline before anyone has time to ask whether the frame itself is complete. Rubio did not rush to escape it, and that hesitation mattered because instead of fighting her accusation directly, he shifted the ground underneath it and forced the hearing toward a subject much closer to Ocasio-Cortez's own political record. He brought up 25,000 families in and around Queens and the Amazon headquarters project that had once been planned for Long Island City, a project tied in the script to 25,000 jobs, an average salary of roughly $150,000 a year, and an estimated $12 billion in economic activity for New York. The point of Rubio's response was brutally simple. Before Ocasio-Cortez lectured him about serving vulnerable families abroad, he wanted the room to look at families in her own political backyard and ask what happened when a massive private employer decided not to build where it had originally planned. He reminded her that she had publicly opposed the Amazon deal, attacked the incentive package, appeared at press conferences, supported the resistance to the project, and celebrated after the company abandoned the Long Island City plan. Then he reduced the whole fight to one accusation that cut through every slogan around it. 25,000 jobs were not lost because of a recession, not because the economy collapsed, not because Amazon went bankrupt, but because the political environment around the project became hostile enough that the company walked away. Ocasio-Cortez had an answer ready because this was not new ground for her, and the $3 billion incentive figure had always been the strongest part of her defense. She argued that New York should not have been handing billions in tax breaks and incentives to one of the richest corporations in the world while public schools were underfunded and public housing deteriorated, and as political arguments go, that one has obvious emotional force because $3 billion is not a number anyone can make sound small. She framed the Amazon package as corporate welfare, cast opposition to it as standing up for ordinary New Yorkers, and made clear that she was not going to apologize for resisting a deal she believed favored Jeff Bezos and Amazon over working-class residents. Rubio did not dismiss the number, which made the response more effective inside the logic of the script, because he agreed that $3 billion was enormous, and then immediately asked the question her defense tried to avoid. If the incentives were part of a larger agreement expected to generate far more in wages, jobs, business activity, and tax revenue, was rejecting the package really the same thing as saving $3 billion? Or was that only the easiest number to put on television? That was where Rubio moved from accusation to arithmetic, and the arithmetic was designed to make Ocasio-Cortez's victory lap look far less impressive than the slogan attached to it. Amazon did not disappear after Long Island City collapsed, it did not stop hiring, and it did not decide that a second headquarters was suddenly unnecessary. it shifted major investment elsewhere, with Northern Virginia becoming the central beneficiary of the HQ2 project. Rubio's argument was that Virginia received precisely the kind of economic ecosystem New York had been fighting over: jobs, tax revenue, construction, transportation spending, surrounding small business activity, housing demand, restaurants, daycare centers, service businesses, and all the secondary commerce that grows around a large corporate campus. In his framing, New York did not defeat Amazon. It simply removed itself from the transaction and watched another jurisdiction collect the benefits while still offering Amazon incentives of its own. That distinction was the blade inside the argument, because Ocasio-Cortez had spent years presenting the collapse of the New York deal as proof that political pressure could defeat corporate power, while Rubio reframed the same event as a case study in how political theater can drive investment across a state line without changing corporate behavior at all. Ocasio-Cortez pushed back harder, returning to the bidding war Amazon had encouraged among cities and arguing that the entire process was distorted from the beginning. She emphasized that cities around the country had competed to offer public concessions to a corporation reporting billions in profits, and she returned again to the image of public housing with black mold and ordinary families being told there was no money for basic services while government negotiated incentive packages with Amazon. It was the best version of her argument because it did not depend on pretending the jobs were worthless. It depended instead on saying that governments should not have to subsidize a company powerful enough to demand concessions from desperate cities. Rubio let that argument remain in the room, then pushed the comparison back to the kitchen table level, asking in effect whether rejecting a large paycheck because you dislike the conditions attached to taking the job can honestly be described as saving money. His analogy was intentionally crude, but that was why it worked rhetorically. Strip away the tax codes, development formulas, projections, and political language, and the fight becomes a dispute over whether refusing an opportunity should be measured only by what you avoided paying, or also by what you gave up receiving. The script's Rubio then widened the attack because Amazon was never meant to be the entire case against Ocasio-Cortez. It was the opening exhibit. He moved from the headquarters fight toward the larger pattern he wanted the audience to see, a pattern in which bold announcements generate enormous attention while the consequences, revisions, abandoned language, and unfinished legislative work receive far less scrutiny. Ocasio-Cortez shifted toward climate policy and the Green New Deal, the territory where she had built much of her national profile, describing it as a framework for clean energy investment, job creation, and communities she believed Washington had neglected. Rubio answered by reaching for the early Green New Deal FAQ controversy and the language about economic security for people unwilling to work, along with the uproar over emissions, agriculture, and the staggering cost estimates critics attached to the proposal. He emphasized that the document was pulled after intense criticism and that Ocasio-Cortez later blamed the release on a staff mistake, using the incident not merely to challenge the policy, but to establish the theme he intended to carry through the rest of the hearing. That theme was accountability, and Rubio's case was that the problem was not simply that Ocasio-Cortez had supported controversial ideas, because politicians are allowed to advocate bad ideas, revise positions, lose arguments, and even admit they were wrong. The sharper accusation was that when a proposal became embarrassing or politically expensive, responsibility seemed to migrate somewhere else, toward a staffer, a movement, a slogan, a misunderstanding, or a version of events that no longer resembled the original rhetoric. From there, Rubio turned toward her 2020 comments on policing, reminding the hearing that Ocasio-Cortez had publicly said that defunding police means defunding police, and had criticized New York's proposed $1 billion NYPD budget shift as insufficient. The script then linked that rhetoric to the period of increased shootings and public anxiety in New York, using those conditions as political evidence against the certainty with which activists had promoted the slogan. And by the time Rubio reached that point, the original question about who he served had been turned completely around, because the hearing was no longer examining Rubio's moral priorities alone. It was examining whether Ocasio-Cortez's own record could survive the same standard she had tried to impose on him. Rubio kept driving into that contradiction because the policing argument was not just another ideological disagreement in the script, it was the next receipt in a sequence designed to show that Ocasio-Cortez was comfortable using absolute language when the cameras rewarded certainty, and far less comfortable defending that certainty once the political environment changed. He reminded the room that in 2020 she had not spoken in vague terms about reform, restructuring, or reallocating resources. She had said that defunding police means defunding police, a line sharp enough to travel instantly through every network, every activist account, and every political argument in the country. The script then moved forward 6 years to August 2026, when Rubio pointed to her appearance on ABC and described her laughing at the rhetoric of an allied socialist candidate who had embraced positions such as abolishing police, abolishing prisons, and canceling Thanksgiving, before she dismissed part of that political moment with the phrase, "woke one was crazy." Rubio's point was not that politicians are forbidden from reconsidering positions because he would soon have to confront that exact issue himself, but that reconsideration requires ownership, an admission that the earlier position was yours, that you promoted it, and that you now believe something different. What he attacked was the attempt to treat 6 years of rhetoric as if it had floated into the political bloodstream without authors, without advocates, without consequences, and without anyone being responsible when ordinary people started asking who had actually meant what they said. He pushed the contrast harder by moving away from slogans and into the unglamorous part of congressional work, the part that rarely produces viral clips, because committee negotiations, legislative drafting, coalition building, amendments, and vote counting do not fit neatly inside a 30-second social media package. According to the script's framing, Ocasio-Cortez ranked near the bottom of her party in turning introduced legislation into enacted law, and Rubio hammered that point with the kind of repetition that was meant to strip away every distraction. Bills introduced, bills discussed, bills promoted, but no signature legislative achievement that could match the scale of the national attention surrounding her. He contrasted that record with his own legislative career, specifically pointing to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and presenting it as evidence that public service is measured not by how many millions watch the argument, but by whether anything remains after the cameras leave. Then he added his confirmation as Secretary of State, emphasizing the 99-0 Senate vote as proof, in his telling, that even people who disagreed with him politically were willing to acknowledge a record of showing up, answering questions, and performing the institutional work required by the office. The attack was obvious and deliberate. Ocasio-Cortez had mastered visibility, Rubio was saying, but visibility and productivity are not synonyms, and a politician cannot indefinitely substitute digital influence for the measurable results that constituents were told would follow. That was when Ocasio-Cortez finally found the counterattack that could not be waved away, because she turned Rubio's entire argument about consistency back on him and brought up Donald Trump. She reminded him that during the 2016 Republican primary, he had called Trump a con artist, questioned his fitness for office, attacked his character and judgment, and said those things publicly in front of tens of millions of Americans, only to later serve in an administration built around the same man he had once condemned. It was a clean hit because the historical contradiction was visible, documented, and impossible to bury beneath procedure, and Ocasio-Cortez used it exactly as she should have, telling Rubio that before lecturing anyone about changing positions, he might want to examine his own record. Rubio did not deny it, and that refusal to dodge became the pivot, because he said plainly that she was right, that he had said those things, that he had been wrong about some of them, and that he had acknowledged the change publicly rather than pretending the earlier words had never existed. From there, he drew the distinction he wanted the hearing to remember: changing your mind is not the scandal. Refusing to own the change is, and in his telling, that was the line separating his evolution from what he portrayed as Ocasio-Cortez's habit of dismissing old rhetoric once it became politically inconvenient. The room in the script had now moved far beyond the opening question about foreign aid, because every new exchange had narrowed the argument from policy toward character, responsibility, and the difference between building a political identity and building a legislative record. Rubio's next move was to say that Ocasio-Cortez had not come to the hearing merely to ask questions, but to perform, a deliberately harsh characterization built around the idea that modern politics has created incentives where a confrontation can be more valuable than a law, a clip more valuable than a compromise, and outrage more valuable than an actual result. Ocasio-Cortez then reached for the personal story that had always been central to her public identity: the bartender from the Bronx who understood double shifts, low tips, cramped apartments, exhausted workers, and the humiliation of being treated like furniture by customers who barely looked up while demanding service. She spoke about having served people literally, about knowing what it meant to work behind a bar, smile through exhaustion, clean tables, count tips, and go home to an apartment she could barely afford, and she used that history as a shield against Rubio's accusation that she did not understand working families. For a moment, the argument shifted back toward her because this was not an abstract policy claim, but a personal credential, one she had used for years to connect her political identity to people who work with their hands, work on their feet, and measure a week not in headlines, but in hours. Rubio waited until that argument was fully on the table and then turned it against her, beginning not with bartending, but with the 2021 Met Gala, the $35,000 ticket price cited in the script, and the white dress carrying the words "Tax the Rich" in bright red across the back. He walked through the ethics controversy surrounding the dress, shoes, handbag, and other expenses, pointing to the House Ethics Committee investigation and the finding that she needed to repay nearly $3,000, then emphasizing her statement that she just never, ever, ever would have allowed that to happen, and the role staff mistakes played in her explanation. The political symbolism was almost too convenient for Rubio's argument, because a politician who had built part of her reputation attacking wealth had appeared at one of the most exclusive events in America wearing an anti-rich slogan, while questions later emerged over whether the costs surrounding that appearance had been handled in compliance with House rules. Rubio connected that episode directly to the Green New Deal FAQ controversy and every earlier moment in which he believed responsibility had been pushed downward toward staff, arguing that a pattern becomes politically meaningful when the same explanation appears every time the spotlight turns from the message to the paperwork behind it. Ocasio-Cortez tried to defend the appearance as an attempt to carry a populist message directly into a room filled with wealthy and powerful people. But Rubio was already moving toward the one subject she had opened herself, the bartender story, and this time he was not reaching for a report, a statistic, or an ethics document. He was reaching for his father. Rubio slowed the pace at that point, not because the argument had weakened, but because the subject had changed from campaign slogans and ethics paperwork to the kind of family history that does not need a press office to make it sound important. He told the room about Mario Rubio, his father, who came to the United States from Cuba in 1956 with his wife, without a degree, without powerful connections, without inherited wealth, carrying nothing more glamorous than the belief that hard work in America could build something their children might one day inherit. Mario Rubio found work tending bar, first in Las Vegas and later in Miami, standing behind counters in hotels, banquet halls, and lounges, working the kind of shifts where the feet hurt before the night is half over and the smile stays on because the customer does not care how tired the person serving the drink might be. Rubio described a household built around overlapping shifts, his father working long hours while his mother worked overnight at Kmart, two parents passing each other between jobs, because keeping the family moving mattered more than whether anyone outside that home ever noticed the sacrifice. There were no magazine profiles, no viral speeches, no documentary crews waiting at the end of those shifts, only work repeated for years until repetition itself became the proof of what service looked like. That was the contrast Rubio wanted to establish against Ocasio-Cortez's use of bartending as a political credential, because he was not disputing that she had worked behind a bar or that the experience had been difficult. He was attacking the way that experience had been converted into a permanent certificate of working-class authenticity. His father, Rubio said, had been a bartender for 30 years, not for one summer, and those words carried more weight in the room than another page of statistics could have because they forced the comparison onto duration, necessity, and what labor looks like when it is not temporary. 30 years meant thousands of nights spent standing, thousands of customers served, thousands of small humiliations absorbed without anyone turning them into a campaign biography, and decades of doing the same job not because it fit a political message, but because a family depended on the paycheck. Rubio's father did not put bartending on a campaign poster, did not use it to prove that he understood the working class, and never had to explain that he was one of them because the work itself made the explanation unnecessary. That was the knife inside Rubio's response. Ocasio-Cortez had taken one chapter of her life and made it central to her political identity, while Marco Rubio had lived that chapter for 3 decades without ever asking an audience to applaud. Rubio kept the focus on his father's routine, on pouring drinks, clearing glasses, wiping counters, coming home exhausted, dealing with the physical toll of standing for hour after hour, then getting up and returning to work because there was no alternative version of adulthood waiting for him if he decided he was tired. He described a man who raised 4 children through repetition rather than rhetoric, a man who never had a follower count, never built a personal brand around sacrifice, and never expected anyone to confuse hardship with entitlement to admiration. The point was not that one family's immigrant story invalidated another person's experience. And even within the script, Rubio acknowledged that Ocasio-Cortez's story was valid, but he refused to let her use that story as an exemption from scrutiny. When she answered that not everyone's father gets to raise a Secretary of State, Rubio agreed, then immediately turned the statement back toward the obligation of representation, arguing that every parent in her district still deserves someone who shows up, does the work, and produces something measurable. In Rubio's framing, the dignity of labor was not supposed to end with the ability to describe hardship persuasively. It was supposed to create a standard for what public service should demand once someone has been given power. He returned to the legislative record because that was where he believed the symbolism collapsed, repeating the claim that Ocasio-Cortez sat near the bottom of her own party in legislative effectiveness, and that none of the bills he highlighted from her record had become law. 6 years in Congress, Rubio argued, should leave behind more than viral confrontations, fundraising lists, magazine covers, streaming appearances, and an internationally recognizable political brand, especially when the entire defense of that brand rests on standing with people who have little patience for symbolic victories. Then he sharpened the comparison until it became openly personal, telling her that the most famous thing she had done in those 6 years was wear a dress, an insult aimed not merely at the Met Gala appearance, but at the imbalance he saw between spectacle and legislative output. The room, in the script's presentation, did not need another explanation of what he meant because the contrast had already been constructed piece by piece. The Amazon fight, the Green New Deal controversy, the policing rhetoric, the legislative record, the Met Gala, the repeated staff explanations, and now the bartender identity itself. Rubio then delivered the hardest version of that contrast, saying his father had served more people in one shift behind a bar than Ocasio-Cortez had served in 6 years behind a congressional desk, turning the occupation she had used as proof of authenticity into the standard by which he judged her political performance. Ocasio-Cortez did not surrender the argument, and she reached for the final moral defense available to her, arguing that Rubio's treatment of her reflected what happens to women, people of color, and working-class voices that challenge established power. She framed the confrontation as an attempt to tear down people who threaten the existing system, a charge heavy enough to force hesitation because accusations involving race, gender, class, and institutional exclusion cannot be answered casually without revealing something about the person responding. Rubio did not deny that barriers exist and instead made his own background part of the response, pointing out that he was the first Latino Secretary of State in American history and returning again to the immigrant parents who had worked as a bartender and a hotel worker before their son entered national politics. That personal history gave him the ground he needed to make the distinction he wanted. Barriers are real, but they cannot become shields that block every demand for evidence, results, consistency, or accountability. His argument was that identity can explain part of the road a person has traveled, but it cannot erase the obligation to show what happened after voters handed that person power. Rubio then widened the frame back toward Ocasio-Cortez's constituents, naming the kinds of people who faced the same barriers without television studios, celebrity invitations, books, streaming specials, or millions of social media followers waiting to amplify every grievance. He pointed to working mothers in the Bronx, veterans in Queens, immigrant families dealing with paperwork, expenses, delays, and bureaucratic walls, people who do not get to transform every obstacle into a national narrative because they still have to get up in the morning and solve the problem in front of them. Those families, in Rubio's argument, are exactly why background cannot substitute for performance, because shared identity means very little if the representative who invokes it cannot produce the outcomes those same families were promised. By then, the debate had reached the point where Rubio no longer needed to introduce another policy topic, because every major piece of his case had already been placed on the table, and all that remained was to close the file. He brought his hands together, looked directly at Ocasio-Cortez, and began summarizing the hearing as an auditor would summarize an account after every receipt had been examined. Rubio began the close exactly where the hearing had started to break apart for Ocasio-Cortez, not by introducing a new accusation, but by compressing every previous exchange into a sequence of questions and answers that made the pattern impossible to hide inside another speech. He said he had asked about the 25,000 Amazon jobs and received a talking point, asked about her legislative record and received a slogan, asked about her own words and received distance from the rhetoric she had once embraced, then asked about working people and received another defense built around personal identity rather than measurable results. The force of the summary came from its simplicity, because after nearly every subject had been argued in detail, Rubio stripped away the explanations and reduced the confrontation to whether the answers had actually addressed the questions. He was no longer trying to win another policy dispute, and he was no longer giving Ocasio-Cortez fresh terrain on which to reset the conversation. He was closing every exit one at a time and forcing the audience back through the same record she had spent the hearing trying to contextualize. Then he reached the final line of the sequence and said that when he asked about working people, about families who go to work, come home exhausted, pay bills, raise children, and never receive applause for surviving another week, she had given him a dress. The room, as the script presents it, did not erupt, and that absence of theatrical reaction mattered because the confrontation had moved past the point where noise could make the moment stronger. Rubio looked directly at Ocasio-Cortez and delivered the closing insult, telling her to go back to bartending and adding that at least a bartender serves someone, a line constructed to weaponize the very working-class identity she had invoked minutes earlier. It was not subtle, it was not conciliatory, and it was not meant to be, because the entire architecture of the exchange had been moving toward a judgment about service. The word Ocasio-Cortez herself had introduced at the beginning when she asked Rubio who he was serving. In the script's logic, Rubio's answer after all those pages of argument was that service is not a biography, not a slogan, not a viral clip, not a symbolic dress, and not the ability to describe hardship convincingly into a live microphone. Service, in the argument he had built, is what remains when the microphone turns off, when the clip stops circulating, when nobody is applauding, and when voters are left asking whether anything concrete actually changed. Ocasio-Cortez did not answer in the closing seconds described by the source, and the script uses that silence as the final visual proof of Rubio's case, with her hands on the table, her shoulders lowered, and her attention fixed away from the cameras that had framed the opening of the confrontation. The chairman's gavel came down. The hearing moved to the next member, and that procedural transition became more humiliating in the script than any eruption from the gallery could have been, because nothing dramatizes political defeat quite like an institution simply continuing without you. The cameras remained, the microphones stayed live, staffers still sat behind their members, but the confrontation was over and the room no longer belonged to the person who had entered it expecting to control the clip. That was the source's central image of the ending. Not chaos, not shouting, not security stepping in, not a viral explosion inside the chamber, but a quiet return to business while Ocasio-Cortez sat inside the wreckage of an exchange designed originally to put Rubio on trial. The hearing had begun with her asking who he served and ended, according to the script's framing, with the much harsher question of whether her own political career had produced enough service to justify the size of the platform built around it. From there, the script steps beyond the individual exchange and turns Ocasio-Cortez into a symbol of a broader political economy built around visibility, branding, outrage, and the ability to convert 6 sharp words into millions of views before a single bill ever reaches the president's desk. It argues that this system rewards politicians for becoming content producers, because content is immediate, measurable, emotionally satisfying, and endlessly recyclable, while the actual work of legislation is slow, technical, compromised, often invisible, and rarely glamorous enough to dominate a news cycle. In that framework, Ocasio-Cortez becomes not the inventor of the system, but one of its clearest products, a politician whose national influence, social media reach, magazine coverage, television visibility, and cultural symbolism grew far faster than the legislative record Rubio was attacking in the hearing. The script's indictment is that followers do not pave roads, viral clips do not repair public housing, slogans do not process veterans' claims, television appearances do not create jobs by themselves, and symbolic performances do not automatically become material improvements for the people represented. That is the gap the source repeatedly calls fraud. Not fraud in the legal sense proven by a court, but political fraud as the script defines it. The distance between the public image of service and the product that service is supposed to deliver. The argument becomes even harsher when it claims that the damage is not confined to Ocasio-Cortez herself, because every failed performance wrapped in the language of reform can make it harder for serious advocates of those reforms to be taken seriously later. Every time a politician appears to hide behind identity instead of answering a substantive criticism, the script argues skeptics become more willing to dismiss the next person who raises a legitimate concern about discrimination, class barriers, or structural inequality. every time a movement's most aggressive slogans are treated as disposable once public opinion shifts, opponents gain an easy way to argue that the movement itself was unserious from the beginning, even when some of its underlying grievances remain real. Every time staff members become the explanation for an embarrassing document, an unpaid expense, or a political miscalculation, the lesson received by younger activists is that responsibility is something leaders demand from institutions but negotiate away when it reaches their own desk. The script therefore frames the tragedy not as one bad hearing, but as the possibility that a massive platform built with the help of millions of people who wanted politics to operate differently was spent too often on performance and too rarely on the grinding institutional work required to convert attention into law. That conclusion returns one final time to the people outside Washington. The workers, the source insists, understand the difference between saying the job matters and actually doing it because they live that difference every day. They are nurses finishing night shifts, construction workers standing in the heat, drivers running another route, warehouse employees scanning another pallet, service workers covering for someone who called in sick, parents calculating rent against groceries, and people whose reward for consistency is usually nothing more dramatic than the lights staying on another month. Nobody gives them a national platform for arriving on time. Nobody writes a magazine profile because they worked through exhaustion, and nobody treats their personal sacrifice as sufficient proof that every decision they make afterward must therefore be correct. The standard Rubio's argument demands for politicians is the same one those people live under already. Show up, do the work, accept responsibility when the work fails, and produce something that still exists after the applause disappears. That is why the source ends where it began, with service stripped of glamour, with Marco Rubio behind a bar pouring another drink, wiping another counter, going home tired, returning the next day, and never needing a slogan to explain what the job was for.